from the American Academy of Pediatrics.
The AAP is launching a new podcast, not for pediatric healthcare workers, but for parents.
Anyone who's been a pediatrician and a parent knows that they're not exactly the same.
When I became a mom, it's like a switch turned on. I understood something about the concerns that parents bring to us.
But first, it's June, and that means a virtual digital download from the journal Pediatrics.
The lesson here is think about cannabis ingestion early and often when you have a toddler who presents with altered mental status. Making that diagnosis quickly could save that child an extensive workup and an expensive hospital stay.
These stories and more on Pediatrics on Call, the podcast on children's health from the AAP. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Belinkie. This podcast is for everyone in the medical community, keeping our children healthy and safe.
It's a show by pediatricians for pediatricians.
But anyone who cares about kids will get a lot out of it as well.
Let's start today's episode with the June edition of First Up.
David, what's your favorite state?
Well, come on, it has to be North Carolina. You got mountains over on one side, you got an ocean and a beach over here. There's barbecue, there's lizards, there's salamanders, snakes, alligators. It's awesome. What's not to like?
Oh, yeah, and you love the wildlife. Well, I've lived in 4 states, and my favorite by far is California. I just loved my time there in my 20s and medical training and being able to drive to any landscape or climate in a day from LA. It was magical. I'd go back if my family wasn't all East Coast based.
Well, our next guest is someone who spends time in Vermont, joining us for the latest edition of First Up.
So Dr. Lewis first.
You would think it would be Dr. Lewis first, but no. It's Dr. Rachel Moon. I bet you didn't know that the associate editor of digital media for the journal Pediatrics likes to ski in Vermont. I don't know if she also summers there. Rachel, what is your favorite state to live in or visit?
Well, hello, everybody.
We're getting right into it, Rachel.
Yeah, so I do love Vermont. I actually am not the skier in the family. I am the person who makes dinner and welcomes people back after they go skiing. Yeah. But, and I love summers in Vermont. They are delightful. They're, cool nights, warm days, warm sunny days. And it's just beautiful. So, but I'm like you in terms of North Carolina with Vermont. What's not to like? I love Vermont.
Oh, awesome. And every state we mentioned is working towards improving children's health, and the state featured in our first article is no exception. Researchers in Alabama explored a social determinant of health that can have a big impact on children: clean water and sanitation access. Can you explain, Rachel?
So clean water, we don't think about access to clean water that much in the U.S. And when we do think about it, I usually think that this is a problem in other countries. But that is not true. Even official sources estimate that 11% of people in the U.S. don't have access to safe drinking water. And many people rely on well water for drinking. Others don't live in areas that have centralized sewer treatment systems. So if you don't have access to a centralized sewer system, you have to have a septic system that you are 100% responsible for paying for, and this can be very, very expensive. So there are households that can't afford these septic systems, and they use workarounds so that they can get water and then get the wastewater out of the house, but it may not be sanitary. So for instance, there's this practice called straight piping, where household wastewater, including the sewage, is dumped untreated onto the ground next to the house. So in the Alabama Black Belt, which is a region of southern Alabama that's rural and largely low income, that there's a lot of straight piping. And studies have shown that infections with Necator americanus or hookworm and other sanitation-related gut pathogens have been identified in children living there. So Dr. Claudette Poole and colleagues at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, they went to 3 rural Alabama counties that were known to have a history of water sanitation problems. These counties also have large proportions of families who are African American and who live in extreme poverty. The authors surveyed the parents of children in the communities about their water supply, and then they also surveyed healthcare providers who work in local federally qualified health centers about their screening practices and their knowledge about sanitation-related health problems. And the results are startling. Of the 771 families who completed the survey, fewer than half of them had centralized sewer systems. 12% reported having straight pipes, and 8% reported that there had been raw sewage contamination of their home property in the last year. When the health providers were surveyed, none of them had ever heard of straight piping, and in general, they didn't routinely ask patients about problems in their water or sanitation systems or about gastrointestinal infections. So where I work, we don't ask about water and sanitation system problems in our screening for social determinants of health, and I suspect that if we did ask, there would be families who would say, yes, this is a problem for us. So this study illustrates that we're often unaware of what's right in front of us. We often ask about water supply because if the family's using well water, we may need to prescribe fluoride, or if the pipes are old, we worry about lead. But maybe we need to dig deeper to learn if there are water or sanitation supply problems that could affect our patients' health in other ways.
Well, let's expand our travels around the country and include 24 states, all of which have legalized cannabis. With the rise in cannabis legalization comes a rise in pediatric ingestions and intoxications. We chatted a little bit about this in episode 146, but now we're learning more about how these patients are cared for when they come into emergency departments with altered mental status. What is the story here, Rachel?
So, as we all know, cannabis can have multiple effects on multiple body systems, cardiac, respiratory, neurologic. There can be potential interactions with medication. So we really have to think about this because as more states have legalized recreational use, we have seen the numbers of unintentional ingestions and intentional ingestions skyrocket. So for young children, when they present, they often have symptoms like lethargy, ataxia, altered mental status, which make us put other things that are life-threatening in the differential diagnosis, like head trauma, meningitis, things like that. And so when you have that kind of a symptom, you often get the mega workup, which includes spinal tap, blood work, maybe imaging. And so Dr. Patrick Walsh and colleagues at the Medical College of Wisconsin and Cincinnati Children's Hospital, they did a very interesting study. They looked at these workups, which consume a lot of resources, for children who end up with a diagnosis of cannabis ingestion in states where recreational cannabis is legal and in states where it's not legal. So first of all, what they found was that between 2016 and 2023, the rate of emergency department visits for cannabis ingestion increased sevenfold in states where cannabis is legal recreationally and 18-fold in states where it's illegal. Secondly, if recreational cannabis was legal in the state when the child presented to the ED, the child was much more likely to get urine tox screening and much less likely to get imaging and or an LP. And they were also less likely to be admitted to the ICU or to be put on mechanical ventilation. So it seems like in states where cannabis is legal, there are a couple of things happening. First, it may be easier to get toxicology screens, and emergency department providers may be more used to seeing these patients, and they're more likely to have cannabis ingestion at the top of their differential. And so if you can get a urine tox screen quickly, and if you have an explanation for the child's symptoms, you're much less likely to get imaging or an LP, and you're also much less likely to intubate the child or admit the child to the ICU, as you would anticipate that the symptoms will wear off in a few hours. So the lesson here is think about cannabis ingestion early and often when you have a toddler who presents with altered mental status. Making that diagnosis quickly could save that child an extensive workup and an expensive hospital stay.
Well, there's another way to think about cannabis use and expensive hospital stays. Even though cannabis use isn't always an emergency, we know, in fact, that more teens are taking cannabis recreationally, and doctors are seeing an increase in cannabis use disorder. But with older kids taking cannabis, can it affect how they recover during medical procedures like surgery?
That is an interesting question. Dr. Brittany Willer and colleagues from Nationwide Children's Hospital, they looked retrospectively at the association of cannabis use disorder and post-op complications. Specifically, they looked at stroke, respiratory, and cardiac complications in adolescents who had inpatient surgery between 2009 and 2022. They used ICD-9 codes to identify patients who had both cannabis use disorders and post-operative complications. So again, the prevalence of cannabis use disorder increased dramatically by 50% between 2009 and 2022. And the interesting thing that they found was that compared to adolescents who did not have cannabis use disorder, those that did were more likely to have post-op complications, specifically higher rates of post-op respiratory complications, ICU admission, and mechanical ventilation. And they were also much more likely to have a longer hospital stay. So for me, the study raises a few questions. Since these data were taken from ICD-9 codes, we don't really know how they diagnosed cannabis use disorder or they defined it. And then how much cannabis do you have to use and for how long before you can call it cannabis use disorder? And then how long before surgery should one stop using cannabis to avoid these complications? So I think that this is an important study. And when we as primary care providers are talking to patients who are there for their pre-op visits, I think we do need to ask about cannabis use. And we have to talk about how the use may increase the risk of post-op complications. And we can recommend that the patients stop using cannabis at least until after the surgery.
I don't take care of a lot of teenagers, but one of the more anxiety-provoking calls that I get, especially when I'm a newborn nursery attending, is that a baby had a fall. And thankfully, it happens rarely, and most of the time, the exam of the infant is unchanged. But given babies have big heads, that's the body part most likely to hit the ground, and I struggle with what imaging to order. Rachel, can a new paper in Pediatrics help me make a decision on this?
Well, that's a good question, Joanna, and you're right. So, when it comes to evaluating children who have traumatic brain injury, we try to accurately identify those who have serious head injury while protecting them from unneeded radiation to their brain. But this is trickiest for the youngest children because it's often hard to clinically ascertain if it's been a serious injury, and these children are at highest risk for injury from radiation as well. So this month we have an article by Dr. Todd Lyons and pediatric emergency medicine colleagues at Boston Children's Hospital who took a retrospective look at nearly 125,000 children who were younger than 2 years of age who presented with isolated head injury over the course of 4 years to one of 47 U.S. pediatric emergency departments. So they found that compared to children who were 3 to 24 months of age, those who were younger than 3 months of age were almost 3 times more likely to have cranial imaging, so X-ray, CT, or MRI. However, they are also 9 times more likely to be diagnosed with a clinically important traumatic brain injury. They are more likely to be diagnosed with skull fracture, more likely to be evaluated for abusive head trauma, more likely to be admitted to the hospital, more likely to need neurosurgery, and they're more likely to die from their injuries. So given all of that, the authors conclude that the radiation exposure is worth the risk because we really don't want to miss any of those diagnoses. And in an invited commentary, Drs. Audrey Rott and Mary Clyde Pierce from Lurie Children's Hospital agree. They also importantly point out that we don't want to miss a diagnosis of child physical abuse. And we know that infants and young children with abusive head trauma have often been seen by a medical professional before for the same symptoms that they have now and that the abuse wasn't initially picked up. So while we don't want to be cavalier in our use of radiologic studies, when there is a cannot miss diagnosis, I think we need to proceed with the necessary evaluation.
Well, as a hospitalist, I love that people are looking at some of these difficult decisions that we have to make and helping to give us guidance. As always, Rachel, this has been a really informative discussion, but we have a question for you. Next time you visit Vermont, can we stow away? Also, is there... Also, is there anything else you'd like to state before you go?
So that was very...
It's all in the delivery, people.
North Carolina is lucky to have you, David.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe North Carolina can keep you.
For these articles and more, visit us at aap.org/podcast.
Coming up, we'll tell you about the host of a new podcast from the AAP parenting website, Healthy Children.
There are so many wonderful pediatric podcasters out there.
We were so lucky to have worked with a handful of them on our paper, The Role of Medical Education Podcasts in Pediatrics. I think podcasting is such a great way to spread the word on the latest advancements in our field.
This makes me happy to share some news with you, David. The AAP isn't just going to be podcasting for pediatricians and pediatric healthcare professionals anymore. Now there's going to be a podcast for parents.
That is great news because so many families would benefit from hearing all the AAP has to offer. Wait, does that mean we're going to have a new pediatric podcaster on the airwaves? And if so, who?
Oh, David, this is so fun. I get to break the news to you. It's someone you know. She is an expert communicator and assistant professor of pediatrics at Columbia University Medical Center on the AAP Executive Committee for the Council on Communications and Media.
Wait. That sounds like Dr. Edith Bracho-Sanchez.
It is. She is joining the AAP podcast family by talking to families with the new show, Healthy Children. And we have her on the show today for a mini Pathways to Pediatrics episode where we get to learn how she got to and through pediatrics and all the way to podcasting. Dr. Bracho-Sanchez, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Joanna. It's really so nice to join you both, Joanna and David. I'm pumped. I'm pumped to do this whole podcast, and I'm pumped to talk to you guys today.
Well, we are pumped to have you. Now, you live in New York City and are a fantastic educator already within the American Academy of Pediatrics, but you didn't move to the United States until you were 14 years old. What did it feel like as a teenager to have to move to a whole new country?
That is a question I haven't been asked in a long time. I'll tell you, it was exciting. It was frightening. It was confusing. It was all of the things. I will never forget. And it's just interesting. And, you know, people who have immigrated or even just traveled around the world can probably relate to this. But I will never forget the first time I went to an American supermarket and the first time I went to an American high school. I just will never forget it. I remember my family and I standing there to buy milk, and we were like, there's so many choices for milk. What is happening? And the same thing happened in high school. You know, it's just sort of like the sense of new and awe and anticipation. And you show up, and first of all, we wore uniforms in Venezuela growing up. I show up and everyone's dressed different and everyone looks different. And there's so much going on. And it's the awe, the anticipation, the excitement. I'm so happy you asked me that question. I haven't been asked that in a while.
So you mentioned Venezuela, where you moved from, and the primary language there is Spanish. And when you moved here, did your whole family really take to speaking English, or was the transition between languages difficult?
It was really difficult, Joanna. My dad spoke English. He was the one that got a job here and the reason that we moved here. My dad is a brilliant scientist. He was recruited by NASA, and that is the reason we moved to this country. But other than my dad, none of us really spoke English. I remember he would make us, before moving here, he would make us listen to music in English and sometimes play TV in English. And the only channel that would play in Venezuela in English with the cable service that we had was the Food Network. So I knew I knew this like very random food words, but day-to-day communication was really difficult for me, actually. And, you know, it really gave me another set of skills, which I don't think we talk about enough. I think when you have to learn a language a little bit later on in life, I wasn't that old. I was 14. I turned 15 shortly after coming here. You really learn learn to observe the environment around you. You learn to pick up on nonverbal cues is what we call them, right? And I think now, of course, time has passed. A lot of years have passed. I'm getting a little old, but time has passed. And now, of course, I can speak English. But I think those skills are still there, and they help me be a better pediatrician, be a better mom. And I don't think we give immigrants enough credit for that skill in particular.
Well, I think you got it down now in all respects. Now, you mentioned your dad's scientific career as a research scientist. Did you always know that you wanted to pursue graduate education and go to medical school, or was there a specific moment that inspired you?
David, this will come as a shock to you, I'm sure, but I want it to be the exact opposite of my parents. So both my parents are in science. So my mom was a teacher for a very long time. She taught science, and then she became the principal, actually, of the school growing up when we were in Venezuela. And my dad is a climate researcher. And, I said I was not going to be a scientist. What happened, though, and the reason I sort of ended up leaning in this direction is that I realized I could be useful. And it's so interesting in young minds what power that has. So coming here, I didn't really at first feel like I belonged. And there's nothing, now that we care for teenagers, there's nothing, and that you have teens, there's nothing that teens want more than to belong. And I started hanging out with a group of friends that was all volunteering at the local hospital. And so I started volunteering at the local hospital because I heard that was the thing to do to mark on your application for college. Not really because I was like, oh, I'm going to be pre-med and I need to put this on my CV. I just was doing what my friends who were applying to college were doing. And I realized very quickly that being able to speak both English and Spanish and just being willing to listen, observe, be helpful, was of service to people, was helpful to people. And slowly but surely, I started liking science a little bit more. I was also very good at science. I think I don't want to overlook that. I think because of my parents, I was very good at science. And so slowly but surely, all of the things fell into place for me.
My hope is that my kids become friends with your hospital hanging out friends too.
Right?
And that's like a big hope of mine. But anyway, you're on your way to being a pediatrician now. And along the journey, you say, I'm also going to train in media, which not a lot of physicians do. What makes media so important for children's health, in your opinion?
Joanna, the story of how I ended up doing media is so intertwined with the AAP. I'm so glad we're talking about it on this show. So first off, I was not going to be a pediatrician when I was in medical school. I was always going to be an adult physician. I wasn't the person that was like, oh, I love children so much. They're so cute. All I want to do is be a pediatrician. I love that there are people like that out there. I wasn't that person. I was always going to be an adult provider. What I realized, though, is that for what I wanted to do, and specifically my wanting to make a difference, if I became an adult provider, I would be a little late to be able to help with a lot of different things and be able to impact children's lives, right? And people's lives in general. So I became a pediatrician instead. I started pediatric residency where you currently work, Joanna. And I realized very quickly that I had a lot of resources, right? A lot of websites and links and even podcasts were starting to emerge that I could give to my patients and families who were English speaking. Then when it came to Spanish speaking patients, I didn't really have very much that I could give them as they were leaving the office and going to live their lives, right? I wanted to have something that I could give, that they could read, that could be a little bit of a presence in their lives. And I didn't really have much. And I remember being frustrated by that. Like, oh, I don't have any good stuff, resources to give you. And so I reached out through a dear mentor of mine who has a long history of working with the AAP, Dr. Ken Ginsburg at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, I reached out to the American Academy of Pediatrics. He helped me reach out to Susan Martin and introduced me by saying, I have this resident who's still in training, has so many ideas for things that we can make in Spanish and things that would be helpful and useful to families. Would you be open to chatting with her? Next thing I knew, after that happened, it may have been weeks to months in between. I can't remember, to be honest. But I was on a plane to Chicago to film public service announcements in Spanish, which is actually where I met David for the first time. He was, David, I don't know if you remember this, you were leaving as I was coming in to record. And I just remember looking at you like, wow, he's been doing this for some time, and you can tell he's so good at this, right? And so for me, it was really just from a place of wanting to give to my community and wanting to share all the information that I was learning. And with time, that has evolved, right? With time, I got additional training in journalism. With time, I've worked at media organizations, but that's really where it came from.
Well, Edith, I do remember that day extraordinarily well because I was incredibly impressed when I saw you. You were so poised and clearly so good at this. I was like, oh my gosh, we are bringing the talent. And as someone who sees about half of my patients in Spanish, I was so thrilled that we were going to have the native speaker recording these segments because I knew immediately how helpful they were going to be. So yeah, that was a great day. And I'm so impressed to see where you've gone with this since then. And that brings us to the new Healthy Children podcast. When does it launch and what's it going to be like?
Thank you so much, David, for all of that. It launches June 6th this week. I'm so excited. It will be really just a down-to-earth, intimate set of conversations that I'm having with amazing experts, many of whom are also parents. And we're really going to get to the meat of what parents are asking these days. We're living in a really exciting time where we have a lot of information. I think it becomes really hard when you're a busy parent to sift through all that information. So what we're hoping to do is to make something that feels relatable, that feels like you can just relax and take a listen and have a cup of coffee with us while at the same time learning something that will be useful in your day-to-day life as a parent.
And Healthy Children is not the first podcast that you've hosted. Can you talk a little bit about starting Las Doctoras Recomiendan?
Yes! So it was such a ride. I'll tell you about it very quickly. My first podcast in Spanish was called Las Doctoras Recomiendan. We ended up having it distributed through Univision, but it started when I was a resident. I really just asked my resident friends, I said, does anyone want to podcast with me? And at the time, gosh, this must have been 2017. There were not that many of us podcasting. We ended up, after covering 4 seasons, I believe, and a lot of child health information, we ended up transitioning to a different type of show, which I then hosted with my sister, which was called Entre Madres y Doctoras. My sister has a PhD in biomedical engineering, and we're in the thick of it together. My sister has 2 little boys. I have 1 little guy at home, and it really just became the space to document and log the things that we go through together, supporting each other. So now that I'm doing this Healthy Children podcast, I come with this, I think intention is the word that I would use, to make it a place where we can share things that are helpful to us in addition to the latest evidence.
So you mentioned that you have, and I don't think you said this, but you should, an adorable son at home, William. And being a mother is one of the most hands-on ways to learn pediatric medicine. How has that influenced your career?
Oh my gosh, David. I feel like I arrived as a pediatrician when I became a mom. I look back now and I was a pretty good pediatrician, right? Well-trained, evidence-based, all of the things that you can hope for. But when I became a mom, it's like a switch turned on. I understood something about the concerns that parents bring to us. I understood just how important, how precious these little people they bring us are, right? And I think when you have that understanding, it just translates to the way that you listen, the way that you counsel, the things that you recommend, how seriously you take people. Although I like to think that I always did take parents seriously, but there's something that you understand when you become a mom. And there's something about being more practical as well in the advice that I give. Just knowing how hard and how busy life is for parents these days.
Well, I cannot wait for parents to tune into your new podcast and hear all of the pediatric insights you're going to offer them. And before we let you go, Edith, what's the one thing you love about being a pediatrician?
Oh my gosh, this is going to sound so cliche, but the families. I'm a primary care pediatrician, so I get to see families from the beginning and through the years, and those relationships, those bonds, and the growth that we go through together is really what makes my job, right? It really is what makes it, and it is what keeps me waking up and going to work every day.
Well, Dr. Edith Bracho-Sanchez, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you both so much for having me. I hope everyone listening will help us spread the word. Again, we're just creating a resource that we hope will be helpful to families. Thank you.
To listen to Healthy Children and learn more about its dynamic host, visit us at aap.org/podcast. At the end of every episode, we like to leave you with something positive or enlightening. We call this segment Say Ah. David, what's your Say Ah this week?
Well, Joanna, as my kids grow up and go do stuff, it is rare that I get them all in one place. But we've got almost a week where all 5 are back home for a moment. And just having the house filled with all that laughter is spectacular. So I'm just saying for the entire time they're here.
Oh, that's so cute. And my Say of course, about my kids and specifically about my oldest, Mira. I think I've mentioned on the podcast before that she learned how to read in kindergarten. And as a part of their finishing the grade, she had to read a book to her class. And we practiced at home. And I'm just so proud of her and how much she's learned in just this first year of school.
Oh, what a big girl. What was the book, though? You must know.
It's called Pearl. And I'm not sure who the author is, but it's about a mermaid who makes a pearl in the ocean. It's beautiful.
Oh, I like this. That's it for today's episode. If you like Pediatrics on Call, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and help us spread the word. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Pediatrics on Call.
Pediatrics on Call is a production of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Our producer and editor is Ann Johnsos. Our audio engineer is Doug Nagel. Joe Puskars is our associate producer, and Susan Martin is our executive producer. Our theme music was composed by Matthew Simonson. Join us next week when we'll focus on gun violence prevention.
We'll talk to Dr. Emily Lieberman, a pediatrician who witnessed a mass shooting and now makes advocacy her mission. I'm Dr. David Hill.
And I'm Dr. Joanna Parga-Belinkie. Thanks for listening.